So welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion here at Pacific School of Religion. And this is our first Lavender Lunch of the 2021-2022 academic year. My name is Bernie Schlager, and I serve as Executive Director of CLGS. And for today's Lavender Lunch, we're delighted to welcome theologian and librarian Keegan Osinski, who will discuss her recent book, Queering Wesley, Queering the Church, published this year by Cascade Books, and the book's presentation of a prototype for thinking about Wesleyan holiness as an expansive openness to the love and grace of God in queer Christian lives, rather than the limiting and restrictive legalism that is sometimes found in Wesleyan theology and praxis. Keegan Osinski is librarian for the areas of theological studies and ethics at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. And she holds a BA in philosophy and theology, a master's degree in library and information science, a master's of theological studies, as well as a carpenter certificate in religion, gender, and sexuality. Her research interests are liturgy, sacrament, and ritual studies, as well as queer theory and philosophy of religion. And she is a member of the Church of the Nazarene and therefore does work in Wesleyan theology. The co-sponsor for today's Lavender Lunch, we're thrilled to have the Pacific School of Religion United Methodist program co-sponsoring this. And I'd like to introduce Professor Thomas Hermans Webster, who is our new assistant professor of United Methodist Church Studies here at PSR. Tom.
Thank you, Bernie. Welcome and good afternoon, and welcome Keegan to the West Coast, back to the West Coast in your case. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the UN Studies program here at PSR and invite you to participate. If you're an alum, reach out and let's see what we can do together in your local church. If you're interested in taking a class, come on, let's do it. Let's figure out ways that we can learn together and that we can grow together and explore what Keegan's going to introduce for us. I'm really excited about this conversation today. We're using the book, which, by the way, the cover is just beautiful. We're using the book in United Methodist Studies 1 in the spring as a companion to John Wesley's sermons. It truly is a critically important text, both for the theological academy on the whole, but especially for Wesleyan studies today. I want to read both a quote from Jörg Rieger, who's a professor at Vandy, that's on the back of the book to give you a sense of what we're doing here, and read you a quote from that I think might be the most important line in the book. So from Jörg Rieger, expect to be surprised by the many ways in which Queering Wesley takes us back to Wesleyan essentials. Love, new birth, perfection, salvation, and grace all emerge in new light with fresh energy and urgency. If the heart of holiness in the Wesleyan tradition is transformation rather than endorsement of the dominant status quo, which it is, this book is a must read. I agree with Professor Rieger, and this from page 46, I think may be the most important line in the entire book. By loosening the church's grip on restrictive binaries of sex, gender, and sexuality, we can avail ourselves of the limitless transformative power of God's love. Keegan, we're so excited to have you. And we are excited to explore that limitless transformative power with you today and throughout the school year here in the Methodist Studies program. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Tom. Keegan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Cool. Wow. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Tom, for those kind words. It's been so exciting to get this book out there and like to have people read it. Like it's so crazy and funny and amazing and exciting. I was telling someone recently that this book still feels like a Microsoft Word document to me. Like the fact that it's actually a book and that people are reading it and like, you know, marking it up and highlighting it is just like so beyond anything. And it's so much fun to talk about it. So I'm so excited that y'all are going to be reading it in class. Hopefully I can like stop in during that class in the spring as well. Because really, more than anything, I see this project as a starting point. I don't think I've solved anything or, you know, come to any final conclusions about anything, but I do think I've started something new. And I think that there's so much more work to be done in this area. And I'm so excited for other people to kind of pick this up and just continue with it and run with it. As I was kind of doing my final edits and doing my last read through of it, there were several points where I was like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. I had like other ideas or ways it could have gone. And I was like, you know what, that's okay. Like other people are going to do that. And it's really exciting just to have other people excited about this project. So thank you so much for being here and for being interested in my work. It's really such a joy and a pleasure. So all I really want to talk about is kind of the background of the project, like where it came from, why I started it, why I'm doing it, and what I hope for kind of into the future with this project. So it really started, gosh, I guess 4 years ago now. It started with a conference paper that I wrote in the spring of 2017 for the Wesleyan Theological Society's annual meeting. I just kind of had this idea. I was in a queer theology class here at Vanderbilt in the Master's of Theological Studies program. And I just kind of had this idea. What if I take one of John Wesley's sermons and do a queer reading of it? So basically, as Bernie mentioned, I am a member of the Church of the Nazarene, which I always like to say is like the evangelical version of the Methodists. So we are a Wesleyan denomination, but we are a little bit more on the conservative side, more evangelical than mainline. And to that end, same with the United Methodist. And what I came to find out, pretty much every single Wesleyan denomination is not affirming. So the fact that there are, as far as I know, no affirming, outwardly, explicitly affirming Wesleyan denominations was really kind of surprising to me as I had learned Wesleyan theology. I was educated in a Nazarene school, so I, learned my Wesley, and I found it to be really generative, really open. There is like a really serious openness to John Wesley's theology as a whole. And so I was just curious what would happen and how I could play around with his work that is still so, generative and foundational to the Wesleyan denominations. The Wesleyan denominations talk about John Wesley all the time. We use his sermons. We use Charles Wesley's hymns. We use Wesleyan theology very self-consciously. And I just knew that there was something there that we could use to create or think about a more liberative sexual ethic, a better way of treating LGBTQ folks, and really not only embracing them or tolerating them in the denomination, but really engaging with queer theory and queer life as itself a good and as itself, a mark of holiness. So the first chapter that I wrote, or the first essay I wrote, was on Wesley's sermon, Circumcision of the Heart. So basically I took this sermon and I submitted it to the literary criticism of queer reading, which basically means I read this sermon with queer eyes as a bisexual queer woman, as a Wesleyan, as an educated, theologically educated person, I read this sermon in such a way that I asked a lot of questions of it, specifically with regards to gender and sexuality. So kind of just messing around with these like normative assumptions that are in the text, asking questions, playing around with it, flipping things on its head, that kind of thing. And so I gave a presentation at the Wesleyan Theological Society. I gave this paper. It was fairly short at that point. It started out just with 8 pages, a quick 15-minute conference paper. And if you've ever been to an academic conference, a lot of times it's like you're just like reading a paper to like 2 people, and like maybe one of them's your mom, she's in town or whatever. But this was like a full room, like standing room only. There were people like peeking into the room from the hallway, which like in a conference setting like that is very strange. But it was so exciting to see, okay, people are really interested in this conversation. And I found myself at this really interesting and unique place where, because I am theologically educated, but I'm not ordained by a Wesleyan denomination. I don't have, credentials or really like a call to ministry as such. I'm not employed in an academic institution that is, run by or affiliated with a Wesleyan denomination. So I have this kind of freedom that comes with a lack of authority, right? So in the sense that a lot of people that I know who are also super smart, very engaged in social justice, in sexual liberation and LGBTQ rights and things like this, they find themselves in a little bit of a trickier situation if they are ordained or if they are employed in a university that is not affirming, because their livelihood really is set on these denominations that are not affirming. And so they can't really say or play around or do these a little bit more like risky kind of things, which again, I just find it to be fun. So for me, and that's my privilege, right? I have this space of privilege where I don't have to really worry about my livelihood. I can just kind of play around with the theology, which is, in my mind, the only theology worth doing really is the fun kind. So I'm able to do that, and I went to this conference, I gave this paper, people were really interested in it, some people were upset about it, which makes sense. But from there, I turned that first paper into a term paper for the queer theology class I was in. So I expanded it to, a full 20, 25 page paper. So that's basically in the chapter Circumcision of the Heart that is in the book now, is pretty much what I wrote in 2017. And then the following year, I wrote my master's thesis for the program at Vanderbilt. And for that project, I wrote the introduction and then 2 more chapters. So I wrote, I think, the new birth, where I take Wesley's sermon on the new birth and kind of juxtapose it with the idea of coming out, and think about ways that being born again is a kind of coming out, right? And turning from, repenting from a life of sin, which we might think of a life in the closet, or a life of repression and suppression and lying to ourselves and to our loved ones about who we are, thinking about leaving that behind and moving into a new life of coming out and being fully ourselves. And then I did a chapter, I think, on perfection was the other one I did for my thesis. So in that one, taking John Wesley's sermon on perfection, which is, foundational, talking about Christian perfection and sanctification and holiness, which is always going to be at the front and center when you're talking about Wesleyan theology, and using Nazarene theologian Mildred Bangs Winecoop, her seminal book, A Theology of Love, where she kind of was one of the first people to make a big deal of and really define holiness specifically as perfect love of God and neighbor. So she pulls out from Wesley this focus of holiness as love, period. And this is kind of a shift in holiness tradition as a whole in Wesleyan theology and Wesleyan denominations' understanding of holiness. And this is in 1972, I think that book came out. And she actually talks about this need to do some translating work, right? So Wesley is from the 18th century. And so she's like, we need to do some translating work to make Wesley relevant for today, because we still use his work, we still use his sermons, we use his theology. It's so important to us as Wesleyans. And so we have to do some translating work to make it continually useful for us today. And I'm reading this in 2020 now, and that we kind of need to do that again. It's time marches on, and the world changes and the way we think about things changes. And there's certain ways that we can totally use Wesley's work in a way that speaks to us still today. And so using Wine Coop to focus on holiness as love really was a core kind of piece of the work. So that was my master's thesis, the introduction, and then a couple more chapters. So at this point I had 3 chapters, an introduction, and what I did next was I took a couple weeks of the summer. I got a fellowship at Point Loma Nazarene. They have a Wesleyan center there. That's my alma mater. That's where I did my undergrad in San Diego, California. And they have a little fellowship thing where they allow you to access the library. And so I went there for, I think, a week or 2, and I just sat down with those collected works of John Wesley, and I looked through all the sermons. And I didn't read all of them like all the way through, but I definitely looked at all of them. And basically what I did was I chose 7 more sermons. And a lot of people ask me, like, how did you choose these 10 sermons? How did you even choose, circumcision of the heart to begin with? Like, why did you choose, what was your method for selection? And I want to have a really good answer, but I don't. And so in the introduction, if you read it, I do have a little note about the selection and how it's really unexplainable. And I connect that to this kind of queer experience of attraction, and how you can't really put a pin in exactly what it is about, say, a person that you find attractive. Or like how that works, like how does that spark? What is that spark? You know it when you see it, right? And sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, and it might change who kind of sparks that interest in you. And that's basically how I worked with these sermons. As I looked through them, some of them I was just like, oh, yeah, there's something there. There's just something there. I can tell, I have an intuition about it. So it's not really like a good methodological answer, but that's the truth. So I kind of just chose these sermons based on that intuition, that spark, and what I thought I could find there. And then from there, I put together my proposal. I sent it off to the publisher, and they accepted it. And then I had to write. So I would take those sermons, I would read them over and over and over. That was my first step, and just kind of mark them up and let my mind just kind of wander and just really like get to know them. I became very intimate with these sermons, and till I could just read them, ask them questions, mess around, play around. Some of the Bible texts, I did a little bit of, biblical exegesis and queer reading of the Bible in there. And just, had tried to upset these norms and assumptions that are in the text, for the purpose of creating a more expansive understanding of holiness as love that includes, as well as liberates, LGBTQ folks in this church space, in a Wesleyan denomination space. So that's how I got here, and a little bit about that. And then also, I guess I want to say something that was really important to me as I was writing, and I always, in addition to always keeping holiness in the forefront as a good Wesleyan, and this idea of perfect love in God and neighbor. The other thing I really wanted to be really self-conscious of was being faithful to a Wesleyan ethic or ethos or whatever of like, what is Wesleyan? What is a Wesleyan theology? Because it's something I believe in. And I think I think Wesley, if you're gonna have like Christian, if you're gonna be a Christian, I think being a Wesleyan one is a pretty good one. And so I was like, I think you can make a case, and I try to throughout the book, that the Wesleyan doctrine, the Wesleyan theology, the Wesleyan way of thinking, it really lends itself to a liberative queer reading, a liberative queer world, life, church, all of these things, that you can be affirming and be Wesleyan. It just seems so obvious to me. And so I tried to kind of support that thesis with Wesley himself, though of course, I read it in a little bit of a like sideways kind of funny way. It still is faithful to Wesleyan thought as far as I understand. And so I tried to be really conscious of that and do that really on purpose, because I really believe in it. And I think Wesleyan theology can be affirming, can be liberative. And so I would really love to see into the future, people being self-consciously Wesleyan and self-consciously affirming of LGBTQ life, and LGBTQ Christians who are already here among us, right? We are already in the pews. So, thinking like stopping this kind of binary understanding of like the church versus the LGBTQ community, like that's not how that works, queer folks are in the church already. So what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be a queer Christian? What does it mean to be a queer Wesleyan? Like, there are certain pieces of that kind of life that are really generative and life-giving and good. And I think the church at large can really benefit from identifying and working with queer Christians to kind of expand that rather than shut it down at every juncture. I think that's about all I really have to say. I don't know if you all have questions or if I can be more specific or talk more about any certain parts or anything.
Yeah, thank you, Keegan. Wonderful. Yeah, so let's open the floor to questions. You can either raise your hand or unmute yourself and show yourself if that is comfortable. So I'll try to keep a view on the room. We have about 40 people here. Anyone with a question or comment? I'm trying to watch the hands.
I see Carol has a hand
Oh, good.
up.
Yeah, thank you. Carol.
Thank you. That was fascinating. How did your home church receive this? How is your pastor and the people in your community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been very lucky that my personal congregation, it's quite small, but they are generally supportive. It's a little bit complicated, of course, because it's not an affirming denomination. But I've been very lucky to really, so I didn't grow up Nazarene. I didn't really grow up in church at all. I just went to a Nazarene college because it was kind of close by home, and I was like, oh yeah, it's a Christian school, like it'll be whatever. And I just through a lot of, providence, I suppose, became part of this community. And so I've been very lucky to be loved and taught by Nazarenes who have loved me regardless. Like they love, not despite that I'm queer, but that, they love me as myself. And so I'm going to just keep saying I've been lucky because I just feel like I have been so lucky to be a member of local congregations that have been supportive of me personally and given me a space to worship and serve. My pastor has gotten quite a few phone calls and emails. So she and I kind of have to navigate that together. But yes, it's been a challenging experience for sure, but part of the reason that I am able to do the work that I do, I think, is because I've been so lucky. So there are, countless stories of Nazarenes, Methodists, like Wesleyans who are queer and had to leave the church because they've been abused, they've been, just mistreated. They have a call to ministry that they can't fulfill because they're not allowed to. And so they have to leave. And that just hasn't been my experience, again, because I've been so lucky. And so I feel this sense of kind of responsibility to bear witness and be a queer Christian in a non-affirming denomination and just be myself there. And I'm going to keep doing that as long as it's healthy for me. And so far, so good. So I'm happy to be able to do that because there have been so many people who wish they could stay and couldn't.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have a few questions in the chat, one from Reverend Ann. What challenges did you find in the process institutionally with your doctoral committee?
None really. So I will say again, I don't have a PhD. It wasn't a doctoral thesis. It was a master's thesis. So I did a master's of theological studies at Vanderbilt, which is an interdenominational, non-denominational, very progressive, very affirming space. And so I was very supported. My committee chair, my first reader was Ellen Armour. And she was, super helpful with the whole process and really supportive. And so institutionally, that was not a problem at all. And again, I have the benefit of being a librarian. So I work full time here at Vanderbilt, and I'm able to kind of have that institutional support as a scholar as well, which is amazing and great, and enables me to do work like this as well. So that's really great.
Very cool. So let's see, we have Court, and then Teresa, then we have Professor Tom, and then Maggie. So next question, let me read this one. As one who is and grew up Nazarene, it feels a constant uphill battle with most church folk about queer affirmation. I have hope for long-term change in some of the young clergy I know, but it looks like a really long-term hope. This may sound harsh, but I genuinely want to know what you think. Is staying in this denomination worth it?
That is such a good question, and a real question, and a difficult question. And it's one I talk about with a lot of people. I've had this conversation 100 times. And my advice is always the same. And honestly, it's usually to leave. But this is a very personal, thing. And I am happy for people to stay if that is healthy for them, but it often is not. And so I recognize that, and I would never advise someone to, continue something that was, mentally or physically, of course, or spiritually unhealthy for them. I hear you that I can see some hope. I certainly have, I've talked for a long time about kind of my role in the denomination as kind of like a lighthouse. I can just be run my mouth and just kind of be loud and say what I think, and people will come toward me, and then they kind of find each other. So I've been able to really facilitate, a network of some more progressive Nazarenes. And you're right, there are some young clergy that are doing really great work in this area and who really desire a more affirming denomination. But, as far as the polity is concerned, it's much more complicated, and I don't really have hope for the denomination to actually change, if I'm completely honest. And that's for sure a longer conversation. And I will talk about the Church of the Nazarene all day long because I love it so much. And also I hate it so much. It's very complicated, of course. I'm sure you all understand. Yeah, I love the church, and I love to kind of be in it in this way, which is, not without difficulty. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really a difficult decision to make whether or not it's the best decision for you to stay in it, depending on what your goals are, what you personally feel, and what you feel is right for you and where you feel called.
And thank you. And I see one chat question, then we'll go to Professor Tom and then to Maggie. This is from someone at the Church for All Peoples. What is specific about Wesley's theology that leads you to argue it is affirmative and inclusive?
Yeah, so again, Wesley, when you say Wesleyan theology, it's going to be synonymous with holiness, Christian perfection. Like that's the main thing, is this holiness that is a gift from God that we can participate in and live within in this life. And again, I'll cite Mildred Banks Weinkoop and her reading of Wesley, which is that holiness ultimately is perfect love of God and neighbor. And so in that sense, if we are working toward holiness, if we are receiving holiness, if we are trying to be holy as God is holy, as we have been called to be holy, ultimately that means engaging in perfect love. And so that can mean a lot of things. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of love not being one thing, and it being multifaceted and multivalent. And it looks different in different times, in different places, between different people. And so it does not discount queer love. And also it doesn't discount the acceptance of queer love as, part of a holy church, a holy life, a holy person. And so I think you can kind of just make this like logical, thread through Wesley's work and build out a really positive, liberative sexual ethic, really. Obviously, it's not going to be explicit like Wesley. Wesley says gay people are good. Like, probably not. And I'm okay like admitting that. I'm not going to say like Wesley is like this proto-queer theorist or anything like that. He's a man of his time. But we as Wesleyans, we receive this heritage, this legacy of Wesley, and we continue. Like I talk a lot about how tradition is not this like monolith in the past that we like look at and we're like, oh yeah, look at that tradition over there. And we get like farther and farther away from it as time goes on. No. I think of tradition as like a river or a stream that we are part of, and it comes from somewhere, and also it goes towards somewhere else. And as with a river or stream, you can change the direction of that river or stream, but it's still the same river or stream. And so that's kind of the way I'm working in it. So using Wesley into the future requires a little bit of massaging, a little bit of like messing around. It's not going to be this monolith in the past of like, this is Wesley. You hold it up and it's unchanging. Like, no, we're real people living in time and history, and things change, and the way we read things change, and that's okay. And it's useful and good even. So in that sense, I think, yeah, Wesleyan theology really does lend itself to a more positive and affirming.
Thank you. And I'm Professor Hermans-Webster.
I think Maggie's hand was up before mine, actually. So Maggie, go for it, and then I'll hop in.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hermans-Webster. Yeah, again, really quite appreciated your talk on your methodology and just the exploration and creation of this book. Probably gonna order a copy next pay period because very exciting. I'm a Methodist student at PSR in my final year and going toward ordination, and even though it's a different path from the academic, just from your perspective of of taking this queer theory lens to Wesley's sermons. What from your analysis and your experience with the queer view of the text would you take and give toward young or queer Methodist clergy in formation?
Yeah, so really the book, my goal with the book was for it to be what I call like accessible academic. So it's definitely an academic text. There's a ton of footnotes. The bibliography is quite extensive and quite good, if I can say so myself. Lots of like further reading and stuff like that. But I like to think that my own writing style is pretty accessible and easy to read and understand. And I tried really hard to define my terms. I have basically a full page in the beginning of like defining what queer means, what a queer reading is. So I try to make it accessible to pretty much anyone, and including clergy, because I think it can be useful for clergy and people who actually are engaging in like parish ministry. Because that's where, the rubber meets the road with a lot of this academic theology. That's where it's worked out among actual people. And so that piece about actual people and praxis, I think is really in there. And it's very clear. And I, tried to be really explicit about that as well. And so as far as like one specific thing or piece, so for one thing, all of them all the chapters are sermons, right? So, I mean, the chapters themselves aren't sermons, but so one thing my first reader in my thesis said is like, sometimes when she was reading, she was like, this is like preaching. You're kind of preaching here, which I don't actually know how to preach. I've never taken a preaching class. I don't know how to write a sermon. But working with sermons, originally, they were meant to be performed, for a congregation of some kind. So the content, the initial like kind of raw material that I'm working with was meant for, people, or, a congregation. And so there's definitely a really useful and practical aspect to this work that ultimately, again, will come back to love, right? Holiness as love. Love is a really active, real life, interpersonal relationship. You can't love abstractly. It really is about the meeting, the face-to-face, how we treat each other as like physical bodies that are meeting in space and time. And so all of that, is wrapped up in this. And that is ultimately what matters at the end of the day, is the people that you're coming into contact with as a pastor, and how you are able to love them, and how are you able to create a community where people feel valued and safe and able to learn and explore without fear. And I think all of that is, part of this project.
This builds on both of the questions that you've just been talking about. One of the things that I found really helpful in your introduction was your handling of the famous Wesleyan quadrilateral. The thing that Wesley never said, that for some reason is all we think about when we think of Wesleyan theology. And what was so striking to me, and I would love to hear you talk more about it, was your emphasis without overbalance or being out of balance, your emphasis on experience as a way in for LGBTQ Wesleyans, but also for other queer folk who are being introduced to Wesley. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you read experience as that entry point, but also how you read it in the constellation with tradition, reason, and scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main places I took inspiration from or really worked with was Pamela Lightsey's work. So she had her book, Our Lives Matter, came out in 2014, I think. And she uses, she's Methodist, and she uses the Wesleyan quadrilateral in a certain way that is, there is like queering happening in the way that she uses it as a method. And then likewise, there's a lot of queer theology already happening. So this was kind of another like impetus for me, is like queer theology is kind of old hat at this point. It's pretty common, but it's not happening in a explicitly Wesleyan register. And so I took a lot of inspiration, and I did a lot of reading in other queer Christian theology work. And one of the work that helped with that experience as an entry point is Dawn Moon. Her book, now I can't think of what it's called, maybe like sex, politics. Let me look. I'm actually going to look it up right here. God, Sex, and Politics. That's what it's called. And that's kind of a more like ethnographic kind of thing. She went to churches and talked to them about, how they experience different things, whether they're affirming or not. I want to say some of those churches that she talked to may have been Methodist. But something that came up over and over again was that people, no matter how they said they read the Bible, at the end of the day, if it didn't match up with their experience always won out. And she found this over and over again. So, if the reason, the way they're thinking about things didn't match up with how they actually experienced it in the real world is going to win out. And so I think that is really informative for the way that we think about, like Maggie was talking about, our actual engagement in ministry. At the end of the day, people care more about, how you treat them maybe than what you say, or, the words of the Bible mean something different to people who experience it differently. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that was kind of a lot of the work that I pulled from to like flesh out this like quadrilateral and the way that we think about it, because it is such a useful tool, absolutely, for thinking through these things.
Keegan, we have a question, let's see, from iPhone William Martin. And that is, can you describe how it felt to be spending time with the words and voice speaking to you, the beauties of relating with original text? And then the second part of the question is, or comment, does Wesley have any clobber passages?
Yeah, so I was actually really surprised by what I found in reading the sermons over and over and getting really well acquainted with them. For one thing, he doesn't talk about sex, like basically at all, or gender. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, we got this like pietistic thing going on, very disciplined method. Like I was like, he's going to be like, sex is bad, and I'm going to have to deal with that. He just doesn't mention it. And I think it is because of, in the time, it was just like, you just don't talk about it, right? Like it wasn't polite to talk about sex or anything even approaching sex in mixed company, in church, in a sermon. You don't do it. So in that sense, it kind of made it easier because he didn't really have a lot to say. And so it kind of gave me a little bit more space to work with. So there weren't really any of these like clobber passages. And there weren't really any of those like typical clobber passages that we think of. He doesn't really deal with those. And if he does, he doesn't deal with them the way that we are used to hearing them as anti-gay texts, because again, the time was just so different. And so again, that gives us a freedom, right? We're so used to hearing these scripture passages read a certain way in the 20th, 21st century. But for him, he was used to hearing them a different way. And so even just that fact in itself kind of opens it up and makes you remember like, oh yeah, like the Bible's freaking old and like it's from another time. It's very weird. Like it's not speaking to us today. But it does We just have to do a little bit more work to get there. And we have to do some creative reading. Even the most literal readers of the Bible are working really hard to make their reading at all accessible or relevant, right? And so we can be free to do that ourselves in a way that is more loving and open to the kinds of lives that we have seen as life-giving.
Very cool. Other questions? So we have some comments on there that Wesley was maybe the world's worst husband.
I found out it's so funny. Like, I really didn't know that much about Wesley before I got started. And now I have this like really like weird like affection for him as this like weird dude. And like so many of the stories I read about him, like his whole like situation with Sophie Hoppy, like how he wasn't like, he was gonna like, he like cast lots to see if he should marry her, and was like, oh, guess not, God doesn't want me to marry her. And it's like so weird and funny. And like, yeah, he didn't get married until he was like 50 something years old, and then that marriage was actually awful. So yeah, fascinating, super fun, love the weird stories, learned so much. I wish I could have put none of that, unfortunately none of that made it into the book.
And a shout out for the beautiful hardcover edition of the book. And then Christopher Ashley, not a question, but comment. I'm quoting them. What you are doing with the Nazarenes, I'm starting to do at Asbury Seminary. It's an uphill battle, but I found a lot of life and joy.
Yeah, I mean, I find that like, again, like so much of this work is really about relationships and just like being yourself, like unapologetically. Speaking of apologetically, I was very clear that this is not a work of apologetics, right? I'm not trying to fight. I'm not trying to, give reasons for why queer people should be accepted in Wesleyan denominations. Like, I'm not interested in that conversation anymore. There's lots of work done out there on these kinds of things, but I just am not interested in any anymore. I am just interested in being myself and doing my work. And so that's like just what I'm gonna do.
Great. We have time for another question or two. I'm scanning the room. Anyone else, feel free to either put it in the chat or unmute yourself. If you'd like to, you can show your face. Another one from Professor Hermans-Webster.
Yeah, I'll go if nobody else has one. It's a two-parter. What's next? And could it possibly involve the explanatory notes on the New Testament? Since you've already used half of the doctrinal standards of the United Methodist Church, why not use the other half?
That's a great, some people have been like, yeah, who are you gonna queer next? That's another question I get a lot. Yeah, the explanatory notes, that would be really interesting. I think the only thing that really would hold me back from that is I'm not a biblical scholar. So that would be a little trickier and maybe more boring, honestly.
Well, and they're like fortune cookies. Like, I just looked up the explanatory notes to try to see about the clobber passages, to see if he says anything in the Corinthians texts that were mistranslated in the 40s. And he writes like 20 words on each verse and like doesn't touch so much stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I don't really have a plan for a new project at this point. I'm still definitely, like, once this book came out, I was like, I know that this book is going to create a lot more work for me on its own. So I get to do things like this. There are several like churches that are doing like book studies on it, preaching teams and stuff who are reading it together and want me to come chat with them. So if anyone here is doing anything like that, I'm more than happy to talk with you about it. I love hearing what other people think and how they find, it useful or not, and whatever, and ways that you might use this work in your own context. Super happy to do that and talk to people.
great. Let me just scan the room one more time. I wanted to say thank you, Keegan, for being with us. This was wonderful. Really privileged honor to have you as our first Lavender Lunch of the season. Thank you, everyone, for attending. There will be, this will be posted on our website and on our Facebook account. Just this Thursday, if you're interested, our Latinx Roundtable is having their first Queer and Latinx Faith conversation with Professor M.T. Davila in 2 days on mental health care and Latinx theology and activism at 12:15. So please join us. And again, thank you, Keegan. This is really wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Check us out at clgs.org. And definitely get Keegan's book. I would say either hardcover. I have the soft cover. I find it beautiful. And so thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for coming. Okay. Well, thank you, Keegan. That was really great.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah. And thank you, Tom, for co-sponsoring with the United Methodist program.
I'm happy to do it. I'm so excited that the book is out after tracking its development through Twitter, and I'm excited to teach it. And
Yeah, I'm so there's a handful of people who are teaching it, and I'm just like,
Oh,
that
great.
is so much fun. And I've actually Dr. Rieger has taught a chat. He's done the